In the golden salons of Vienna, under chandeliers dripping with light, she stood in a gown of white tulle, delicate as frost, weightless as breath. A spark, no bigger than the glowing tip of a cigarette, kissed the fabric. In an instant, the dress became a cage of fire. They called her Die Tabakprinzessin, the Tobacco Princess, a title that mocked as much as it mourned. At 18, Archduchess Mathilde of Austria died not on a battlefield, not in exile, but in a blaze born of secrecy, fear, and the unyielding shadow of her father's rules. Was it a tragic accident? Or the inevitable end for a young woman trapped in a world where appearances mattered more than air? Tonight, we open the locked doors of the Habsburg court to relive the final moments of the girl who burned for a mistake she could never admit. Archduchess Mathilde Marie Adelgunde Alexandra of Austria entered the world on a cold January morning in 1849 in Vienna, a city where every cobblestone seemed to carry the echo of marching boots and the weight of imperial banners. Her birth was not just a family affair, it was a matter of state. She was the youngest daughter of Archduke Albrecht, Duke of Teschen, a man as unyielding as the steel of the sabers he carried, and Princess Hildegard of Bavaria, a woman born into grace and duty in equal measure. Her father, Archduke Albrecht, was no ordinary aristocrat. He was one of the most formidable military commanders of the Habsburg Empire, a veteran of battles, a strategist revered for discipline, precision, and the art of control. Those traits seeped into the very air of the household. The palace where Mathilde grew up was a fortress in more ways than one, its marble halls gleaming, its chandeliers casting warm light. But every gesture, every word, measured and weighed. The Habsburg court was an intricate machinery of etiquette. From the moment Mathilde could walk, she was expected to curtsy at the proper angle, to stand still when spoken to hold her fork just so. Every laugh was quieted to a polite smile, every movement trained until it became reflex. Even in childhood, there was no place for clumsy accidents, loud opinions, or tears that lasted too long. And yet, Mathilde was not without light. Accounts from her governesses speak of a child with quick wit and a spark in her eyes. She had inherited her mother's delicate beauty, clear skin, chestnut hair, and a smile that could, for a moment, soften even her father's stern gaze. But beauty in a royal girl was not a treasure to be enjoyed. It was a currency. From her earliest years, it was made clear. Her life's worth would be measured by the alliance her hand could secure. Her daily life was a balance between luxury and constraint. In the mornings, she learned French and Italian from tutors brought in from abroad. In the afternoons, she studied music, her small hands coaxing melodies from the piano. But even these lessons were not merely for her enjoyment. Language was a tool for diplomacy. Music, a performance for visiting dignitaries. She could recite Goethe as easily as she could embroider a handkerchief, both equally important in the theater of court life. Her mother, Hildegard, was perhaps her only true refuge in those early years. Hildegard was gentler than her husband, though bound by the same strict codes. She tried, in quiet ways, to shelter her daughter from the harsher edges of their world, slipping her an extra hour in the gardens, allowing her to ride her beloved pony beyond the palace gates when her father was away. Those moments, rare and unspoken of, were when Mathilde's laughter was unguarded, her posture relaxed, her hair tousled by wind instead of a lady-in-waiting's comb. But such freedoms were fleeting. The Habsburg court was a place where children were rarely allowed to be children. By the age of 10, Mathilde was attending formal dinners in miniature gowns, learning to move through a ballroom with the same grace she would need one day as a bride in a foreign court. Her playmates were mostly cousins and siblings, many of whom she barely knew beyond their titles. Every conversation was chaperoned, every friendship evaluated for propriety. Even her future was not hers to dream. The Archduchess's marriage prospects were spoken of as though they were state treaties waiting to be signed. Her name was whispered in the same breath as distant princes, grand dukes, and heirs to thrones she had never seen. The expectation was unspoken but absolute. One day she would leave Vienna, not for love, but for duty. And yet, despite the grandeur that surrounded her, Mathilde's world was small. The palace gardens, the stables, the cathedral, these were the boundaries of her childhood. Beyond them lay a city she glimpsed from carriage windows, a world of markets and music halls, of laughter unmeasured by protocol. She could watch it, but never touch it. Those who knew her in youth describe her as poised, intelligent, and obedient, the very image of a Habsburg princess. But there were cracks in the porcelain. Small acts of mischief slipped through her otherwise perfect manners. A roll of the eyes when her governess's back was turned, an extra sweet taken from the kitchen, a daring gallop on horseback when she thought no one was watching. Harmless rebellions, but rebellions nonetheless. Her father, Albrecht, noticed everything. He was a man who believed that discipline was love, and that a daughter's worth was measured by her ability to obey. If she slipped, even slightly, his correction was swift. A sharp word, a withheld privilege, a look that made the air in the room heavy. Mathilde learned early that fear could be just as binding as love, and that one could live in a palace and still feel the bars of a cage. Still, to the outside world, she was the picture of grace. She appeared beside her parents at parades and operas, her gloved hand resting lightly on her father's arm. Painters captured her in oil and canvas, a vision of youthful promise draped in silk. Foreign visitors wrote of her as a charming young archduchess of considerable beauty and refinement. But behind the formal portraits and polite smiles, there was a young woman who knew her life's path was not her own. She had been born into a story already written, her role defined before she could read it. Each step, each gesture was part of a performance meant to uphold the image of the Habsburg dynasty. A family is bound by its own rules as by the borders of its empire. And yet, as she grew into adolescence, that spark in her eyes, the one her governesses had noticed, did not fade. It was not rebellion, not yet, but something more subtle, a longing for something unscripted, something that belonged to her alone. In a world where even her laughter could be corrected, she began to seek small, hidden ways to claim herself. She found them in fleeting moments, lingering in the stables to feed an apple to her horse, stealing away to the palace library to read novels that were considered frivolous for a young lady of rank, exchanging quiet jokes with her ladies-in-waiting when her father was out of earshot. None of these were grand acts of defiance. But in the rigid air of the Habsburg court, they were enough to remind her that she was more than just a daughter, more than just a pawn on the chessboard of empire. It was in these small rebellions that the seeds of her tragedy were planted, not because they were dangerous in themselves, but because they hinted at a truth that her world could not tolerate. That even a princess might yearn for a private life, for choices unsanctioned by duty. In the years to come, that yearning would find a new outlet, one far more risky, far more forbidden, and it would bring her, step by step, toward the moment when silk and fire would meet. Because for Mathilde of Austria, the palace was not only a home, it was a prison lined in gold. And even the most beautiful prisons have doors that some hearts will try to open, no matter the cost. By the time Mathilde reached her mid-teens, The image of her future had already been painted in the minds of those around her. It was gilded and ceremonial, the portrait of a queen in waiting. Her name had been tied to the Italian court, her hand promised to Prince Umberto, heir to the Kingdom of Italy. It was not the language of romance that accompanied the engagement, but the language of treaties and strategy. This was a union designed to stitch two empires together, to hold in place a fragile patchwork of political interests between Austria-Hungary and its southern neighbor. For the court, this was cause for celebration. For Mathilde, it was the unveiling of a path she had never chosen, but had always known would come. She was to be a bride in a foreign land, a queen one day, her duties endless, her life under constant scrutiny. And yet, there was a sliver of hope. Those who saw her alongside Umberto spoke of a certain warmth, a natural grace in their interactions. Perhaps she thought this arrangement could grow into something resembling affection. Perhaps marriage could be not only duty, but a form of escape from the watchful eyes of her father's palace. But hope in the Habsburg world was as fragile as the porcelain teacups in which it was served. Outside the gilded halls, the alliance between Austria-Hungary and the Kingdom of Italy was rotting from within. The political climate shifted quickly. Old disputes over borders, military ambitions, and national pride began to sour the once celebrated engagement. What had been declared as a symbol of unity became an emblem of tension. And in the way of royal engagements, the fracture did not come with raised voices or slammed doors. It came with a formal announcement, clipped and impersonal, that the match was no longer in the interest of the crown. The break was not just political, it was deeply personal for Mathilde. The hothouse flower that had been carefully grown to bloom in a foreign court was suddenly left without a garden. Her status as a future queen dissolved overnight, leaving her in an uneasy position. She was still a princess of Austria, still adorned with jewels and titles, but the trajectory of her life had been publicly altered. In the insular world of court society, such reversals were not forgotten quickly. Whispers began almost immediately. At receptions and dinners, ladies spoke behind fans, wondering if she had been the one to fail the engagement. Was she unsuitable? Did the Italian court find her lacking? Even if the true reasons lay in the shifting sands of politics, the stain of rumor clung to her. In Vienna's tight circles, perception could be as damaging as truth. Mathilde withdrew. Where once she had appeared regularly beside her parents at public events, she began to favor the quieter corners of palace life. She still performed her duties, the formal visits to charitable institutions, the religious observances, the occasional appearance at the opera. But her presence had lost its brightness. Observers noticed a subdued air about her, a smile that no longer reached her eyes. Inside the family, the engagement's collapse was treated less as a loss and more as an inconvenience to be managed. Archduke Albrecht, ever the strategist, was quick to look for new alliances, new possibilities for his daughter's hand. But for Mathilde, the experience had shifted something deep inside. She had been prepared to fulfill her role, to live a life defined by diplomacy and obedience. And in return, she expected, if not love, at least the stability of a certain destiny. That stability was gone. With it came a sense of quiet humiliation. The court still dressed her in silks and pearls, but she knew the glances that passed in the salons. She knew that her name, once spoken in the context of a royal match, was now accompanied by a faint shadow of failure. And she knew that every move she made from here on would be weighed against the question, what now? It was in this fragile state that small cracks began to widen. Mathilde had always been disciplined in her public demeanor, careful to present herself as the model daughter of a Habsburg archduke. But behind closed doors, she began to look for small spaces where she could breathe without judgment. In a court where even leisure was scheduled and monitored, she began to crave moments that were unscripted, unobserved. The habits she formed in this period were not yet dangerous. A little more time alone in her apartments, longer walks in the palace gardens, the occasional refusal to attend a dinner when her name was not strictly required. But the change was noticed. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered about her mood, about the way she sometimes sat at the window for hours, staring at the city beyond the palace gates. The Habsburg court was not a place that tolerated visible discontent, especially in its women. A princess was expected to embody composure, to absorb disappointment without allowing it to alter her outward form. Yet, Matilda was human. She felt the sting of a future taken away. She felt the isolation of a life where even grief had to be hidden behind lace and etiquette. The palace was full of rules, some written, many spoken only through a lifetime of glances and corrections, and Matilda had learned them all. But in the wake of her broken engagement, those rules felt heavier. The constant presence of attendants, the formality of meals, the endless expectations of posture, of speech, of silence. It was a suffocating script, and she was no longer certain she wanted to play her part so perfectly. And so the smallest acts of independence took on new meaning. They were not rebellions in the eyes of the world, but they were rebellions to her. And somewhere in that shadowed interior life, she would develop a habit, a secret, that brought her brief comfort in the quiet hours. A habit that, in a palace obsessed with appearances, was forbidden. A habit that one day would take her life. The Habsburg court was a place where even the smallest gestures could be dissected, where a misplaced smile could be interpreted as a political statement. For Archduchess Mathilde, the lesson had been drilled into her from childhood. The eyes of the court were always upon her. Yet, as she moved into the uncertain years after her broken engagement, she began to cultivate something that belonged to no one but herself. It was a habit born not of fashion or rebellion, but of stolen privacy, and perhaps a longing for control over at least one corner of her life. Matilda smoked. In mid-19th century Vienna, this was not an uncommon vice among men of the military or the aristocracy. Cigar smoke drifted through the salons where generals planned campaigns, and long-stemmed pipes were as much a part of the gentleman's image as his tailored coat. But for a young, unmarried woman, a princess of the House of Habsburg, the act was unthinkable. It was considered unseemly, almost scandalous, a breach of the carefully cultivated image of feminine purity and restraint. And for Matilda, there was the added complication of her father. Archduke Albrecht, soldier to his marrow, despised tobacco in the hands of women. He considered it a vulgar habit, a moral flaw that spoke of weak will and undisciplined character. He had more than once made his disapproval clear, and in the language of a man used to commanding armies, his disapproval was an order. But smoking became Matilda's secret. It began innocuously enough, a cigarette offered by a lady-in-waiting during an evening of hushed conversation, the balcony door slightly ajar to let the winter air carry away the smoke. It was a novelty at first. The strange burn in her lungs, the way the smoke curled upward like a tangible sigh. But there was something else. Something that made her return to it. The sensation of doing something unsanctioned. In a life where every hour was scheduled, every word rehearsed, smoking became a pocket of unstructured time. She could light a cigarette and, for those minutes, there was no court etiquette, no performance. Just her, the flicker of the match, and the quiet. It was, in a way, an act of ownership over her breath, her body, her moment, she became careful, almost ritualistic in the way she hid it. The cigarettes themselves were kept in a small ivory case, a gift from her Bavarian relatives, tucked inside a locked drawer in her writing desk. Matches were hidden in the false bottom of a jewelry box. She would choose moments when her father was absent, her mother occupied. The household's rhythm slowed. Often it was in the late afternoon, when the winter sun was low and her ladies-in-waiting drifted into their own quiet gossip. She would slip into a side room, a salon rarely used, or out onto a balcony where the heavy velvet curtains concealed her from the corridor. There was always a risk. Servants passed silently through the palace. Doors opened without warning. A hint of tobacco could cling to hair, to clothes, betraying her. But the very presence of risk sharpened the pleasure. It was not just the taste or the ritual. It was the knowledge that this was hers alone, unseen and unapproved. For months, perhaps longer, it remained a contained secret. Only a few in her immediate household may have guessed, and if they did, they kept their silence. In the hierarchy of palace life, even small secrets could bind people together in webs of loyalty and complicity. But habits have a way of deepening. What began as an occasional indulgence became, in times of stress, a daily refuge. When whispers about her failed engagement reached her ears, when her father's voice grew sharp over some imagined lapse in conduct, she would find herself retreating to that familiar ritual. The scratch of the match head, the first inhale, the thin ribbon of smoke unwinding into the air like a private thought. There is a peculiar intimacy to secrets kept within walls. They become part of the architecture, part of the rhythm of a place. For Mathilde, the palace was full of rooms she had never seen, corridors she would never walk. But she knew by heart the few spaces where she could stand with a cigarette and be sure no one was watching. She carried those places in her mind like a map of escape routes. And yet, the habit was not without its shadow. There was always the looming figure of her father in the background, the man whose word was law, whose approval or disappointment could alter the course of her life. She knew, with a clarity sharpened by years of living under his gaze, that discovery would bring not just reprimand, but humiliation. For Archduke Albrecht, the disgrace would not be in the act itself, but in the fact that his daughter had concealed it from him. Deception, in his world, was as grave as disobedience. Still, she did not stop. Perhaps she believed she could balance the two worlds indefinitely. The obedient daughter in the public rooms of the palace, the quiet smoker in its hidden corners. Perhaps she believed that if she was careful enough, the line between them would never blur. But secrets, like embers, have a way of smoldering in the dark. All it takes is the right draft of air, the wrong moment, for them to flare into something uncontrollable. And for Mathilde, that moment would come not in a hidden salon or a shadowed balcony, but in the full glow of a summer evening, dressed for a celebration, with the eyes of her family and the court all too close. What she could not have known, what no one could have known, was that the spark she held so carefully between her fingers would one day ignite more than tobacco. It would set fire to the very fabric of her life. By 1867, Vienna was in one of its restless phases. Balls glittered in the Hofburg, music poured from the salons, and the empire's newspapers hummed with talk of war and diplomacy. But inside the private quarters of Archduke Albrecht's household, the air around Mathilde had grown still, almost heavy. The broken engagement with Prince Umberto was no longer a subject for the official court bulletins, but in the narrow corridors of aristocratic gossip. It still lingered like perfume on an old gown, faint, but impossible to wash out. Even as months passed, she could feel the weight of eyes upon her, measuring her every appearance for signs of recovery, or worse, decline. Publicly, she did what was expected. She attended Mass with her mother, appeared at select charitable functions, stood politely through military parades at her father's side. But these appearances were fewer now and shorter. Her place in the grand theater of the court was no longer center stage, but the wings. Privately, she withdrew into her own set of rooms. High-ceilinged spaces with polished parquet floors, their windows looking over manicured gardens she rarely set foot in. Here, she found a kind of uneasy refuge. The formalities that governed the rest of the palace softened within these walls. A book could be left open on a chair. A shawl could be draped carelessly across a bed. And here, more than anywhere else, she could indulge in the small rituals that kept her sane, including the secret that would one day consume her. Her ladies-in-waiting learned to read the atmosphere. Some days she would be talkative, asking about the latest Italian fashions, teasing them about their suitors. Other days, she would sink into long silences, gazing at the smoke curling from her cigarette with an expression they could not quite read. It was not sadness exactly, nor contentment, more like the pause before a thought too private to be spoken aloud. In those months, Mathilde's world narrowed to the handful of people she saw daily. Her mother, whose gentle concern was often overruled by her father's severity. Her father himself, present more as a figure of command than a source of comfort. And the servants whose loyalty was purchased as much by discretion as by coin. Friends from her youth drifted away, absorbed by their own marriages, postings, or scandals. The great Viennese court, with its endless intrigues, shifting alliances, and glittering distractions, moved on without her. The isolation might have crushed another kind of spirit. But for Mathilde, it worked like a strange kind of alchemy. Cut off from the rhythm of court life, she clung more tightly to the few freedoms she had carved for herself. Smoking was no longer just an occasional indulgence. It was a punctuation mark in the long, monotonous sentences of her days. Each cigarette lit in secret was a small act of defiance, a reminder that she still had power over something, however small. But the secrecy itself became part of the strain. Every time she struck a match, there was the flutter of calculation. Was her father in the palace? Were the corridors empty? Would the scent linger too long on her gown? She developed the habit of leaning out of windows, holding the cigarette at a careful angle so the breeze would carry the smoke away. She would drop the stub into a porcelain vase, then bury it under loose petals from the bouquets that decorated her rooms. This careful dance might have continued indefinitely, had life in the palace not tightened around her. Archduke Albrecht's duties took him away to military councils and inspections. But when he was home, his presence was a force felt in every hallway. The sound of his boots on the marble, the clipped tone of his commands. They carried into her chambers like a change in air pressure. The Archduke's standards for his household were as unbending as his military orders. Discipline, composure, and control were virtues to be enforced. Any sign of carelessness, a wrinkled gown, a late arrival to a dinner, was met with a cold rebuke. In that climate, Mathilde's smoking was more than forbidden. It was dangerous. If discovered, it would be a humiliation for him, an admission that his daughter had breached the code he ruled his family by. And so the palace, already a place of grandeur and formality, became for Mathilde a labyrinth of caution. The very walls seemed to press in with their silence, holding her secrets for now, but ready to betray her at the smallest misstep. In the rare moments she ventured beyond the palace for private leisure, a carriage ride through the Prater, an evening at the theater. She found herself scanning faces in the crowd, wondering who might carry a story back to her father. The city beyond the gates was alive, unpredictable, free in ways she had never known. Yet it was also perilous. A princess's smallest impropriety could be amplified into scandal. A whispered rumor could outrun the truth by miles. And so, she retreated further. The court calendar filled with events she did not attend. The Archduke's reception saw her less and less. In place of public visibility, she embraced a kind of curated invisibility, a choice that protected her from scrutiny, but deepened the solitude that fed her longing for rebellion. The human heart does not thrive in stillness alone. In the absence of open doors, it will seek cracks in the wall. For Matilda, those cracks were the moments between obligations, the hushed hours in her rooms, the stolen minutes with a cigarette. It was not the smoke itself that kept her returning, but what it represented. The idea that she could still decide something for herself, however small, however fleeting. She could not have known how thin the line was between her secrecy and her undoing. How quickly the balance she thought she had mastered could tip. From a harmless ritual into a moment that would decide the rest of her life. That moment was coming. The summer of 1867 would bring it, in a blaze brighter and faster than she could imagine. And in its light, all her careful concealments would vanish. June 6th, 1867, began like so many summer days in Vienna. Warm light spilling through tall windows, the air in the Habsburg tinged with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. In the Duke of Teschen's household, the mood was one of preparation. That evening, there was to be a gathering, a formal affair that would draw family, military officers, and select members of the Viennese elite. Matilda's maids laid out her gown hours before sunset. It was a masterpiece of its kind, a pale evening dress of fine white tulle, layered over silk, the skirt full and shimmering in the light. It had been chosen to flatter her youth, to cast her in the image her father valued, poised, immaculate, a daughter befitting the Habsburg name. She moved through the late afternoon in a practiced rhythm, hair arranged in a smooth coil, jewels carefully pinned, gloves folded neatly beside the mirror. Beneath the composure, there was the same quiet restlessness that had marked her days in recent years. A sense that these moments, though beautiful, belonged to someone else's idea of her life. As the hour drew near, the palace's private rooms hummed with movement. Footsteps in the corridor, distant voices giving instructions. Matilda retreated into a smaller salon adjoining her bedchamber. It was one of her favored places, a quiet, softly lit room with a tall window that opened to the gardens, the heavy curtains shielding it from passing eyes. Here, she could breathe for a moment before stepping into the performance of the evening. And here, as she had done many times before, she reached for the one habit she kept hidden from her father's world. The ivory cigarette case clicked open in her hand. She struck a match, shielding the flame with her palm, inhaling until the tip glowed red. The smoke rose in a thin, curling thread, vanishing into the dusky light of the room. For a few moments, there was only the steady rhythm of her breath and the muted sounds of the palace beyond the door. Then, the sound she had learned to fear. Boots. Slow, deliberate, drawing nearer along the corridor. Her father's boots. In an instant, the calm broke. Her mind leapt to the unthinkable. If he entered now, if he saw her, the humiliation would be swift and unforgiving. There was no time to stub the cigarette out properly, no time to hide it away in the case. Acting on instinct, she brought her hand behind her back, the still burning cigarette pinched between her fingers. She straightened her posture, as if she had simply been standing in thought. But in her haste, the glowing tip brushed against the tulle of her gown. The fabric caught as if it had been waiting. Tulle, so delicate and ethereal in appearance, is a treacherous material around flame. The first spark spread in a heartbeat, the fire racing upward, feeding on layers of airy weave. She gasped, a sound that was half shock, half terror, and twisted to see the flames blooming behind her. In seconds, the warmth became heat. The heat became agony. The fire wrapped around her waist, climbing toward her shoulders, devouring silk and skin alike. Her father entered the room at the commotion. What he saw was not his daughter poised for a reception, but a column of fire where she stood. Her white gown turned into an inferno. "Water! Blankets!" The shouts echoed down the hallway. Servants ran, footsteps pounding against the marble. One maid tried to beat back the flames with her shawl. Another threw a carafe of water that hissed uselessly against the blaze. But the tulle burned faster than they could fight it, the smoke filling the room with the acrid stench of scorched fabric and flesh. Mathilde's screams were high and ragged, raw with pain. The fire seared her back, her arms, her neck. Her gloved hands clawed at the gown, tearing at it, but every movement only fanned the flames. In the chaos, someone managed to wrap her in a heavy wool cloak, smothering the last of the fire. By then, the damage was beyond imagining. Her skin was charred in great swaths, blisters rising where the heat had not destroyed the flesh entirely. Strands of her hair, loosened from their pins, had fused into brittle black coils. Her breathing came in short, broken bursts, each one a struggle. She was carried to her bed, the dress cut away in tatters, the cloak left nearby, soaked through with water and ash. The room was filled with hurried whispers, orders for physicians, for ice, for bandages. But there was no illusion among those who had seen the extent of her injuries. In a world without morphine, without the antiseptics that would come decades later, burns of that scale were a sentence written the moment the fire touched her. Her father stood at the foot of the bed, his expression locked into the same cold composure he wore in military councils. Her mother knelt beside her, stroking her hand, murmuring soft prayers. Mathilde's eyes fluttered open once or twice, searching the room as if to anchor herself. Once her lips moved, but the words were too faint to catch. The physicians arrived quickly, but their tools were crude: salves to soothe the pain, strips of linen to cover the wounds, cool compresses for her brow. They could not undo what had been done. All they could offer was the fragile mercy of making her more comfortable, though even that was an impossible task in the hours that followed. The evening that had been meant for celebration dissolved into a night of quiet horror. The great halls of the palace were hushed. The only sound from her wing was the low murmur of attendants and the occasional cry of pain that broke through even the strongest sedative. By midnight, the fire was long extinguished. But in Mathilde's body, it still burned, in the raw nerve endings that screamed with every breath, in the fever that began to rise, in the shock that was slowly pulling her away from the world she had known. The next dawn would not come for her. Night settled over Vienna with the same golden haze it always carried in early summer. But in the private quarters of Archduke Albrecht's household, the light was dim and strained. Candles flickered at uneven intervals, their small flames trembling in the still air. The scent of smoke still clung to the walls, mingled now with the sharp tang of medicinal salves and the metallic hint of burned fabric. Mathilde lay on her bed. Her once perfect posture collapsed into the uneven cradle of pillows arranged to support her battered body. The dress was gone, cut away in frantic haste, replaced by layers of clean linen meant to shield her wounds from the air. But there was no shielding the truth. Her skin, in many places, was raw and blistered, the angry red and ashen gray of burns that no physician could hope to heal in her century. Her breathing was shallow, every inhale a tremor that shivered through her frame. The room was quiet but for that breath, and for the occasional creak of the floorboards as a physician shifted his weight, or the rustle of her mother's skirts as she adjusted the damp cloth on Mathilde's forehead. In moments of pain, the mind will often seek escape. For Mathilde, it came in brief drifts into half-consciousness, where she would murmur fragments of thoughts. The name of her horse, a line from a song she had learned as a child. A word in French spoken so softly no one could catch its meaning. Then her eyes would open again, the pupils wide with a mix of fear and fever, searching the dim outlines of faces above her. There was no morphine here, no chloroform offered for more than a few moments. The physicians did what they could, cooled her skin with water that was refreshed every hour, changed the dressings with as gentle a touch as possible, whispered reassurances that could not mask the inevitability they all knew. Burns of this kind did not heal in 1867. They destroyed the body from within, drawing the life out slowly. Her mother, Hildegard, stayed by her side without pause. She held Mathilde's hand, as if by anchoring it, she could keep her daughter in this world. Her lips moved constantly, in prayer and in quiet comfort. Now and then, Mathilde would squeeze her mother's fingers, a faint, uneven pressure, but enough to tell her she was still there, still hearing. Archduke Albrecht stood apart from the bed, near the tall window. His posture was straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He spoke little. Now and then he would step closer, leaning to hear if she had spoken, then return to his place by the window. His face, so accustomed to the mask of military command, gave nothing away. But the way his eyes lingered on her, unblinking, searching, betrayed a weight he would not put into words. As the hours passed, the fever rose. Mathilde's skin grew hot beneath the bandages, her lips dry despite the careful spoonfuls of water her mother coaxed past them. The edges of her vision seemed to fade. She looked not at the people in the room, but through them, as though watching something far away. Once, her voice, fragile and rasping, broke the stillness. "Mama, it's cold." The words were barely sound, carried more by breath than by voice. Hildegard bent close, smoothing the damp hair from her daughter's forehead, whispering that she was not alone. But even as she spoke, she knew the chill Mathilde felt was not the air. It was the body's slow surrender. Toward midnight, the room shifted. One of the physicians placed his hand lightly at Mathilde's wrist, his eyes meeting the others in silent understanding. The pulse there was faint and erratic, like a candle guttering before it dies. Her mother leaned closer, her cheek brushing Mathilde's temple. "I am here," she said, voice breaking for the first time. "You can rest now." Mathilde's eyes moved once more, toward the ceiling, or perhaps beyond it. She took a shallow breath, then another. Her lips parted, forming a shape without sound. Those nearest swore it might have been a prayer. The final moment came without drama, without a cry. One breath simply failed to follow the last. Her body stilled. The tremor in her fingers faded. The room, already quiet, seemed to drop into a deeper silence, the kind that makes the smallest sound, a chair creaking or a sleeve brushing against fabric, feel deafening. No bells rang. No proclamations were issued. In the first minutes after her passing, the only sound was the soft sobbing of her mother, her forehead pressed to her daughter's motionless hand. The Archduke remained by the window, looking out at the night, his profile etched in candlelight, unreadable. At 18 years old, Mathilde of Austria had gone from a life of controlled elegance to a death shaped by fire and silence. She had not had time for farewells, for reconciliation, for any words beyond the few ragged syllables the burns had allowed her. Whatever dreams she had carried, of love, of freedom, of something beyond the walls of the palace, were extinguished in the same breath that ended her life. In the corridor outside, the palace carried on in muted tones, as though nothing had happened. Servants moved with quiet purpose, messengers were dispatched, and behind every closed door, the machinery of royal discretion began its work. Soon, the official story would take form. But here, in this room, there was only the truth. A girl whose life had been tightly guarded, whose small acts of defiance had been her only claim to herself, gone in the most sudden and brutal of ways. And though the flames had been smothered hours ago, the scent of smoke still lingered in the air, a reminder that the fire had taken more than a gown, more than flesh. It had taken a life before it had the chance to be truly lived. By dawn, the palace was already at work, transforming the truth into something more palatable. Death in the imperial family was never a private affair. It was an event to be curated, written, and remembered in ways that served the dynasty. In the corridors outside Mathilde's rooms, whispers traveled like threads of smoke, too fragile to hold, too stubborn to disappear. Servants spoke of the fire, of the frantic shouts, of the Archduke's voice echoing in the hall. But by the time those whispers reached the marble offices where official notices were drafted, they were altered, softened, stripped of detail. The first communique, released that same day, spoke of a tragic domestic accident without naming its cause. No mention of a cigarette, no admission of an act forbidden under her father's roof. The words were chosen carefully, designed to draw sympathy without inviting scandal. Mathilde's name was wrapped in phrases like beloved daughter, bright future, and untimely loss, as if grief alone could explain her absence. Inside the palace, her rooms were sealed. The silk gowns she had worn only weeks earlier were removed, folded away, or burned quietly to prevent gossip. The small ivory cigarette case, the one she had so carelessly opened on her final evening, vanished. Whether it was destroyed or simply hidden, no one would say. The salon where the fire had begun was cleaned and repainted within days. The scent of smoke was banished, the scorch marks polished from the wood until there was no trace of what had happened. The erasure was not only physical. Within weeks, conversation about her dwindled. The Archduke spoke of her rarely, and when he did, it was in measured tones, as though she had been a distant cousin rather than his youngest child. Her name appeared in memorial lists, but never with the same prominence as living heirs. In the family's public portraits, her absence was filled by the careful spacing of chairs, the strategic placement of flowers, as if she had never been meant to stand among them. Among Vienna's upper circles, the truth persisted in half-light. There were those who whispered it at private dinners, lowering their voices at the moment they spoke of her smoking. For some, it was framed as a cautionary tale, a young lady undone by her own recklessness. For others, it was quietly understood as the cruel price of a life spent under relentless control, where even the smallest private indulgence could prove fatal. Her friends, those few she had been allowed to see beyond court functions, received no official invitation to her funeral. The ceremony itself was private, attended only by family and a select handful of dignitaries. There were no long processions through Vienna's streets, no open casket for the city to mourn. The coffin was closed, the damage hidden from view, her beauty preserved only in memory. It was the same pattern the Habsburg court had followed for generations. Control the narrative, protect the dignity of the dynasty, and bury the uncomfortable details alongside the dead. The empire's memory was a tapestry, and any loose thread was cut before it could unravel the whole. In the weeks after her burial, her name was removed from the roster of scheduled appearances and charitable patronages. The projects she had supported, small hospital visits, quiet aid to widows of military officers, were quietly reassigned to other archduchesses. Her handwriting disappeared from the palace correspondence. Within months, there was little sign she had ever been part of the working life of the court at all. Yet, beyond the polished gates of Vienna, her story took on a different life. In the cafes and parlors of the city, young women spoke of her in hushed, almost conspiratorial tones. They imagined the moment she held the match, the faint thrill it must have given her to claim a habit forbidden by her father's rigid rules. They pictured her startled glance toward the door, the split second in which she realized her mistake. Some pitied her, some admired her. All understood, in some unspoken way, that her death had been more than an accident. It had been the violent collision between private desire and public expectation. For the empire, the fire was a matter to be forgotten. For the few who remembered her laugh, her kindness, the way she tilted her head when she listened, forgetting was impossible. But memory, too, became an act of quiet rebellion. Those who spoke her name did so carefully, as if offering a fragile thing to the air. In the official histories of the Habsburg dynasty, Mathilde of Austria was given only a handful of lines. They read smoothly, stripped of the tension, the smell of smoke, the terrible speed of the flames. They made no mention of how she lived, only of when she died. And so the girl herself, with her moments of restlessness, her half-hidden defiance, her longing for something beyond the narrow frame of her life, slipped into the shadows where all inconvenient truths are sent. The embers of her story still glowed, but only in the minds of those who had been there, who had seen the fire's first spark. For everyone else, she became what the palace had intended, not a cautionary figure, not a rebel, not even a tragedy fully told. Just another silent portrait in the endless gallery of faces, as the empire no longer cared to remember. Years passed, and with them, the precision of the Habsburg court's erasure. New marriages were arranged, new scandals quietly absorbed, and the empire's attention shifted to the slow unraveling of its power in a changing Europe. But stories, even those smothered at birth, have a way of resurfacing, not as official accounts, but as murmurs that drift into the spaces between generations. It began in the smallest ways. A chambermaid, now old and living with her daughter in a modest apartment in Leopoldstadt, told the tale to a neighbor one winter evening, her voice low, her eyes darting to the door as though palace officials might still come to silence her. She described the pale blue of the gown Mathilde had worn, the sudden flare of light, the look, half shock, half resignation, that crossed the young archduchess's face before the room filled with shouts. In another corner of the city, a retired footman passed the story to his grandson, adding details he swore were true. The match that slipped, the hush of the hallway just before her scream, the way the Archduke had turned his face to the window so no one could see his grief. Each telling was slightly different, each shaped by the teller's own memory. But the heart of it, the forbidden cigarette, the rush of flames, the abruptness of her loss, remained. As the decades turned, Vienna itself began to change. The empire dissolved into republics, its palaces no longer centers of unquestioned authority, but symbols of a vanished order. Historians, hungry for the human details the official archives lacked, began to sift through private letters, diaries, and memoirs. In the margins of these documents, Mathilde appeared again, not in the solemn lines of dynastic record, but in fragments that hinted at a real person. One letter from a lady-in-waiting spoke of her laughter, quick and bright, like a glass chime in summer wind. Another, written by a distant cousin, recalled her fondness for sketching in the palace gardens, often ignoring the formal lessons to draw the folds of her own sleeves or the curve of a flower's stem. These were small things, domestic and unimportant in the eyes of official chroniclers, but they brought warmth to the cold outline of her name. By the early 20th century, her story was told in books that blurred the line between history and anecdote. In some, she was a romantic figure, a young woman caught between duty and a private longing for freedom. In others, she was reduced to a cautionary emblem, the smoking Archduchess, whose vanity or defiance led to her doom. Each version said as much about the storyteller as it did about her, but the mere fact that she was spoken of and at all marked a quiet defiance of the Habsburgs' intent. And then came the photographs. Most had been tucked away in family collections, forgotten or misidentified. When one surfaced, a sepia image of Mathilde in a high-necked gown, her gaze turned slightly away from the camera, lips caught in the faint suggestion of a smile. It startled those who had only known her as a line in a book. There she was, alive, unburned, her skin unmarked, her eyes holding the guarded intelligence of someone who sees more than she is permitted to say. Her image began to appear in exhibitions of Habsburg history, usually in a corner or footnote display. People lingered there, reading the short captions, some leaning closer, as if the grain of the photograph might reveal what the official text had not. For many, she became the most human face in the gallery. Not because she was a great political actor or a figure of power, but because her fate was so abrupt, so intimate in its tragedy. Outside the walls of museums, her name found another life in popular culture. A few plays and novels, written in the interwar years, took liberties with her story, giving her lovers she had never met, words she had never spoken, deaths she had never died. In some, she lived longer, escaping the fire entirely to marry in secret. In others, she was deliberately killed, the cigarette only a cover for palace intrigue. These fictions, though far from truth, kept her memory alive in ways the official narrative could not. It is in the nature of forgotten figures to return not as they were, but as the world needs them to be. For those who lived under strict codes of behavior, she became a symbol of the hidden rebellions every woman was forced to tuck away. For those fascinated by the decline of empires, she stood as a quiet metaphor for fragility beneath grandeur. How a single spark, literal or otherwise, could undo what centuries of ceremony had tried to protect. Even now, her name rarely appears in the lists of Austria's most important historical figures. But among those who have heard the story, she occupies a space the official accounts cannot touch. She is not just the girl in the blue gown, nor just the victim of a fire. She is the human pulse that beats beneath the marble mask of history. The reminder that the past is built from lives as fragile, as fleeting, and as combustible as our own. And so, in quiet ways, Mathilde of Austria lives again, in the memory of strangers, in the photographs pulled from dusty drawers, in the breath of stories passed from one voice to another. The fire that took her life could not burn her entirely from the world. It could only change the form in which she remained. In the 21st century, the palace where Mathilde lived is no longer just a fortress of ceremony. It is a tourist stop, a backdrop for wedding photographs, a place where school children are told of emperors and treaties, of balls and military parades. Few guides mention the young Archduchess who burned to death in its halls. And yet, her story is the one that lingers in the minds of those who stumble upon it. A single human crack in the marble surface of imperial history. In a world of camera lenses and open archives, concealment is harder to maintain. The Habsburg court could once control the narrative by sealing rooms, burning letters, and issuing carefully worded notices. But today, the idea that a woman's final moments could be hidden from the public feels both alien and familiar. Alien because our age demands instant images, proof, transparency. Familiar because even now, power has ways of shaping truth to fit its needs. Matilda's death, in the language of her time, was an accident, a phrase that stripped it of context and softened its edges. In our era, we might call it something else, a preventable tragedy, a consequence of suffocating control, a moment where fear of shame outweighed the instinct to cry for help. She did not shout for her father until it was too late. How much of that was pain, and how much was the reflex of a daughter raised under a ruler who prized discipline above love? When we look back at her story now, we see it through lenses her contemporaries did not have. Feminism, psychology, the language of agency. The cigarette in her hand becomes more than a breach of decorum. It becomes an act of private ownership over a life otherwise dictated for her. The moment the match touched silk is the moment private rebellion met the fragility of her world's illusions. In Matilda's Vienna, a woman's worth was braided tightly into her appearance, her obedience, and her marriage prospects. A burn was not just an injury, it was a threat to her value, to her role in the family's political strategy. In our century, we speak openly about bodily autonomy, about the right to make choices even when they displease those in power. But the fear that silenced her is not so far removed from the fears that shape lives now. In boardrooms, in families, in governments, silence is still enforced by the fear of losing place, respect, or safety. There is also the question of memory, how we choose to remember the dead. The empire's attempt to erase her did not fail entirely. Most people who pass through Vienna today will never hear her name. But for those who do, she becomes a mirror in which to examine our own time's selective remembering. We build monuments to victories, statues to leaders, archives for the stories that fit our sense of identity. But the lives that reveal the cost of power, the private prices paid in silence, are often left in footnotes. And yet, in the last decade, her image has begun to reappear in ways that bypass the marble gatekeepers of official history. A photograph of her circulates on social media, captioned simply, "She was 18." It sparks threads of comments from strangers, each offering their own reading of her face. Some seeing sadness, others defiance, others still imagining her in the instant before the fire. Artists sketch her in modern clothes. Filmmakers toy with scripts that set her story in contemporary cities. Why? Perhaps because she represents a kind of timeless fragility, not the fragility of weakness, but of beauty under pressure, of humanity in a world that mistakes control for care. In her silence during those final seconds, we hear echoes of every voice stifled by fear of judgment. In her erasure, we see every life tidied away because it did not serve the story the powerful wanted told. There is an irony in her modern afterlife. The very forces that silenced her now make her story sharper. In an age that thrives on confession and personal narrative, the absence of her own words makes us lean closer, imagining them for her. It forces us to confront the gap between the life lived and the life recorded. A gap that persists for countless others whose truths never fit the official version. Standing in front of her photograph now, in a quiet wing of a museum or in the glow of a phone screen, it is difficult not to think of the fire as more than an accident. It is a metaphor, one that belongs to no single century. Silk is beautiful, but it burns quickly. A life can be wrapped in duty and adorned with privilege, but when touched by the smallest spark, a secret choice, a private indulgence, the whole structure can ignite before anyone dares to act. In that sense, Mathilde's story is not locked in the past. It is carried forward every time someone chooses silence over risk, every time an image is polished to hide the truth, every time a life is reduced to a carefully worded paragraph. We do not have to be archduchesses to understand it. And perhaps that is why she stays with us, because in her final moments, she was not a royal, not a symbol, not a historical footnote. She was simply a young woman, caught between the desire to live as herself and the fear of what that might cost. A fear that, across the centuries, still burns. When I think of Archduchess Mathilde, I do not see a figure frozen in oil paint or a name in a genealogy chart. I see a girl standing near a window, craving a breath of air that was not prescribed to her, holding a match she was never meant to strike. I see the moment when the spark leapt, and instead of running, she hesitated. Not because she didn't understand the danger, but because she understood something else more deeply. In her world, the shame of being seen could feel heavier than the weight of survival. We like to imagine that we are free of those chains now, that our era has shaken off the silences of the past. But look closer. How many still keep secrets because they fear judgment more than loss? How many shape themselves for the comfort of others, until the shape no longer fits the person inside? The fire that took Mathilde's life was visible, undeniable, immediate. The fires we face now are often slower, hidden, the ones that hollow us quietly, while the world calls us perfect. If there is anything her story teaches, it is this. Beauty, discipline, privilege, these are fragile armors. They may protect you from gossip or scandal, but they will not save you when the spark comes, and the spark always comes. History did its best to make her vanish, to reduce her to a cautionary whisper. But the fact that you are hearing her story now means that silence did not win. It never fully does. So, remember her, not as a tragedy in silk, but as a reminder that even the most gilded cages can catch fire, and that the only way to truly honor those we've lost to silence is to speak. This has been Dark Ages Unveiled, where the shadows of history are lit just long enough for us to see the truths they tried to hide. If her story stayed with you, imagine how many others are still waiting to be told. Subscribe, join us, and let's keep turning the pages they never wanted us to read.